Today's scripture passage is Genesis 45, 1 through 8, 12 through 15. You're invited to turn there or follow along on the screen. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt, and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly." Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. After his brothers talked with him. This is God's word.
So I wanted to begin this morning's message by sharing with you a quote that's going to lead into the gist of our discussion this morning. Now, the quote comes from a man named Bob Deffinbaugh. Bob Deffinbaugh is a Bible teacher. You can read his commentary on much of the scripture at Bible.org if you wanted to do so. And pretty much, whatever passages you might be looking at, you can probably Google Bob Deffinbaugh, Bible.org, and find his commentary on a certain passage. But he had a couple of good quotes or good sections in his discussion of this morning's chapter, and I'm going to refer to him several times along the way. Now, here is the first thing I want you to hear. Think about this first sentence. Bob says, "While it is not the solution to every instance of anger, forgiveness is the answer to much, if not most, of the anger we experience in life." Pause. I am wondering, and I won't ask for you to display whether you agree with it or not, but I'm wondering if you guys agree with that statement that most of the time when you are embittered or angered about something, is it true that forgiveness is going to be the key to dealing with that for you? Okay? He says that most of the time, forgiveness is going to be the thing that enables you to move forward. Now he continues. He says, "Unresolved anger leads to bitterness, hostility, and revenge. Forgiveness leads to freedom and reconciliation." Now, how does that tie together with what we are studying in the scriptures this morning? He says this: "No character in the drama of the book of Genesis better illustrates the fundamentals of forgiveness than Joseph. And no chapter of his life more clearly defines and describes the essentials of forgiveness than chapter 45. End quote. So I think then if you were following Bob Deffinbaugh's train of thought, you would probably have to say that if you want to see what forgiveness actually looks like in action, read Genesis chapter 45, this particular section of Joseph's life. It's been an extraordinary life as we've been looking at it, and we've learned a lot from studying this man's life. And now it reaches its fullness. And now all of the fruit is coming to maturity. And now we see some of the key lessons of the life of Joseph. Now, as we were meeting together last week and looking at the preceding chapter, which was chapter 44, we observed that that chapter focused on the manner in which Joseph tested the character of his brothers after he had not seen them for 22 years. Now, it's important to realize that these tests that Joseph was laying out for his brothers were not tests by which he was going to make a decision on whether or not he would forgive them. No, that matter was already settled for Joseph. Joseph had long since forgiven his brothers for what they had done, but Joseph was interested in seeing if reconciliation with these men who had hurt him so badly so long ago. He was searching to see if reconciliation was an option, and if so, what would reconciliation look like with these men? How could they move forward in a relationship together? And so he laid out these tests that was meant to reveal who they had become. Had these men changed? Were they repentant over what they had done over 20 years earlier? And his test was working beautifully because he was getting to see who these men had become. But remember, for Joseph's part, he had already internally released them from the guilt that they had perpetrated against him. Now, when you reach chapter 45, all you're doing is seeing the way his forgiveness, which was already established internally, the way it fleshed itself out with his brothers. And it is a beautiful thing. So let's remember, the stage has now been set for the big reveal. The big reveal. All the tension has been built. Now, Joseph, this austere and yet rather kindly Egyptian potentate, has caught his younger brother Benjamin red-handed in possession of the silver goblet, that very special cup in the life of an Egyptian leader. And it appears that Benjamin has been caught stealing from the second most powerful man on the face of the planet. And Joseph has rounded up his brothers and had them brought back in before him, and they are prostrate in front of him on the ground, begging for mercy, because it appears that Benjamin has indeed stolen from the viceroy of Egypt. Now, you will also recall that at the end of last week's chapter, Joseph's brother Judah steps up. And I reminded you last week that when Judah steps up, this is the same Judah who 22 years earlier had come up with the brilliant idea of ridding themselves of Joseph, ridding their lives of that pesky, arrogant favorite of their father by selling him as a slave. That same Judah has now come forward, and he has begged that Joseph, who is now in power, and he doesn't recognize him as his brother Joseph, he has begged Joseph, please, let me absorb the guilt that rightly belongs to my brother Benjamin. I will substitute for him. I will become your slave for life if you will let my brother go free. And now the brothers are waiting with their breath held to see what the verdict of this powerful potentate is going to be. That is the stage as it is set for the action of chapter 45. So what does Joseph do? Joseph, as he's overcome with emotion, listening to every word that comes from the mouth of his brother Judah, he is overwhelmed with emotion. It is just bubbling up within him, and we've seen this repeatedly through the life of Joseph, how his emotions are so stirred all through these pages of Scripture. It happens again, and he issues a command for all of his wait staff, his service staff, to leave the room, for all of his security detail to get out of the room. I want you to leave me alone with these men. And so all of his staff leaves the room. Now, I thought, why is Joseph ordering for all of his staff to leave him alone in a room with these men. And I wonder what his brothers thought when Joseph dismisses all of the staff to leave him alone in a room with them. Because they don't know who he is, remember. They don't know what he's up to. I'm going to suggest to you some reasons why Joseph may have dismissed everybody for the room, because I want your brain to work. I want you to try to read between the lines here, because these are real people that are no different than you are. And if you would have felt this, Joseph would have felt this. Number one, some people think that Joseph dismissed all of his staff from the room because this was a family matter. This was private stuff. What had transpired between Joseph and these men 22 years earlier had nothing to do with anybody in Egypt. This was private. And he was going to deal with them privately. Now, what do you think? Is that a good idea? You think that might have been part of it? What do you think? Legitimacy? Okay, good, okay. I don't know that there's a right or a wrong in here, but I think this probably would have been part of it, but that's what some people think. Also, some people think that Joseph may have dismissed everybody else from the room in order to protect himself from the violent eruption of emotion that was about to blow. Because he was about to lose it. And he's a very powerful man. And he really doesn't want all of Egypt to see his emotional business. I don't know. What do you think? Is that a possible reason for the dismissal of everybody else? Because he was about to blow. I don't know. Possible. There's a third reason. Well, there are more than three, but here is a third reason. Some people think that Joseph dismissed all of the staff in order to protect his brothers as their guilt was dragged up, because it was going to come up. Now, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I think that probably has a lot to do with this. Joseph is protecting the reputation of his brothers. Nobody else needs to know what they did to him 22 years ago, what scoundrels they had been. Think back through the narrative of Joseph's life with me. And I thought, yeah, I did this week. I could not recall any point in the narrative at which Joseph bad-mouthed his brothers for what they had done to him 22 years ago. Can you think of any point, as we've gone through this, that Joseph bad-mouthed his brothers? Not once. I cannot think of any point at which Joseph even brought up what his brothers did to him. It's different to bring it up than it is to badmouth them. He never even apparently brought it up to anybody how he wound up in Egypt as a slave. We do know, because I spelled it very clearly, he contended for his innocence when he was falsely thrown into a dungeon, but he didn't even indict the woman who falsely accused him that we know of. So here's another one of those character traits of Joseph that I think is mind-blowing, and it's well worth our attention. Joseph carefully guarded the reputation of his brothers. He didn't have a feeding frenzy on the reputation of other people. Now, guys, I think it is quite normal for us in our lives, when others do us wrong, to want to see them exposed and shamed as much as possible. We're not necessarily concerned to protect the reputation of people who do us wrong. We really want to see them get their comeuppance, don't we? We really want, we will freely trash the reputation of people who have done us wrong, and we feel like we're justified in doing that. Joseph would not do that. Grace and mercy in us will not want to see people's reputation trashed no matter what they've done, even to us. Love seeks to protect the reputation of that other person. Now, in order to illustrate a point here, I thought, well, why don't we contrast two people that are prominent in the narrative of the life of Joseph and see what our collective opinions of those people are 3,000 years later. Okay? First person to contrast would be Mrs. Potiphar. Now, do you remember Mrs. Potiphar when she felt scorned? Even though it was her own doing that put her in a situation, and what she conjured up was all false. Do you remember when she didn't get what she wanted? When she felt hurt by the rejections of this young man, Joseph, when he was just 17 years old? What did she do? She fabricated stuff and went around trashing the reputation of this innocent young man. Interesting way to live your life, by trashing the reputation of another person who has wronged you, even though it wasn't even true that he had wronged her. Now, contrast that with this man who, when people do him legitimate wrong, still will not trash their reputations. Now, from our vantage point, 3,000 years later, what kind of respect do you have for Mrs. Potiphar? She's a laughingstock. She's a joke. 3,000 years later, what kind of respect do you have for this young man, Joseph, who's not a young man anymore? You marvel at the restraint and the power of this person, the strength of a person who can refuse to ruin the reputation of people who are legitimately trying to ruin his life. There is no comparison, is there? So I thought, it might be good just to remind you that if you want a reputation like Mrs. Potiphar has, go ahead. Dish the dirt. Go ahead. Trash people. It will not look well on you. If you want to look more like Joseph, I don't want to say it this way. If you live your life like Joseph, believe me, people will know that you are a respectable person who will not trash other people when they're not around, even if they have done you wrong. It is a very respectable thing, is all I'm trying to say. We have respect for Joseph. We don't have any respect for Mrs. Potiphar. Okay, so once again, we see Joseph being what we have described all through this series as a type of Christ. And he is such in this matter as well. And I thought look at this passage. This was a prophecy spoken about Jesus about, we'll just ballpark it, about 1,000 years before Jesus came. And remember, Joseph had already lived about 1,000 years prior to this prophecy being spoken. Okay? But here's what Isaiah prophesied about the coming Messiah, who we know to be Jesus. Isaiah said that when the Messiah would come, he was oppressed and afflicted. I mean, that means mistreated by other people. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And as Jesus stood before the powers of his day on earth, the Herods of the world, the Pilates of the world, those leaders looked at him and says, "What? You won't even speak to defend yourself? Don't you know I have the power to condemn you?" Because he will not defend himself. He will not badmouth anybody. He says, you'd have no power over me if it weren't given to you from above. So anyway, just another way in which Joseph is kind of like a picture of Christ 3,000 years before Christ came. So, look on the screen. Read the first sentence out loud together. Do you agree? Stop. Whoa, 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 whoa. Do you agree with that? Godliness knows how to suffer injustice quietly. Is that true of Joseph? Is it true of Jesus? Then it continues, godliness seeks to protect the reputation of the other, even if that other has wronged you. Now, we'll have more to say on that because there are nuances that I want to develop, but I want to save those because we're going to move through the story. Back in the 1970s, when I was first coming into an awareness of what was going on in the world around me, there was a popular song. Really, this era of my life was one of the most prolific areas of memory for me. In the mid-70s, there was a band called 10cc. You guys remember them? And they did a couple of songs that were really big during the day. But their first big song, in the middle of it, it sort of all quiets down. It's sort of a breakdown section. And in the background, you can hear this woman sort of whispering, "Be quiet. Big boys don't cry. Big boys don't cry. Big boys don't cry." And he kept repeating that because this is a man who's been hurt, and his life has sort of been destroyed. And she's telling him, don't cry. Big boys don't cry. And I thought, well, that kind of encapsulates a truism in our world, isn't it? Isn't that the common knowledge that if you're strong and if you're big and you're tough, you don't cry? Whether you're a man or not is irrelevant. Strong people don't cry. And I kind of thought, is that even true? It's true that people think that, but is it an accurate statement? I'd like to take exception to it, because I think we've established that Joseph is a pretty ridiculously strong man. But does Joseph measure up when it comes to that standard? Let's watch him, verses 1b and 2. It says, "So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it." One of the things that strikes me every time I go through his life is the emotion of this man. It keeps breaking out. It keeps breaking out. And this is when it all really blows, in this moment. And I think, and I would say this, and this is for application for you and for me, I think it's actually a healthy thing when a person, whether it be a male or a female, that's irrelevant to me, I think it's a healthy thing when a person can give full vent to what it is that they are really feeling. And I thought, well, let's just think about this logically. How healthy is it when we have been hurt that we learn to be really good at dissimulating that hurt? How healthy is it that we learn to be really good at hiding what it is that we truly feel? Is that a good thing, that we've learned to be secretive about what's really going on inside? I don't think that's a good thing. That's not a healthy characteristic. What's this big boys don't cry stuff? You're just lying to other people about what it is. And I agree that there are certain settings in which it's more appropriate than others. Like, again, if you're in leadership of a group of people or a meeting or something, it's probably not the best time to be blowing it out. You know what I'm saying? But if you are living a lie in that way in front of other people and you cannot express it, see, that's one thing I learned about Joseph. Joseph had no trouble being in touch with what he was feeling. Joseph was fully in touch with what he was feeling, and he didn't mind letting that out and letting it be known. He wept so loudly, the passage says, that the Egyptians heard him. And I'm thinking that's probably the staff that he had dismissed from the room. Maybe they just went outside and went around to the open window and listened. I don't know. But we know that it was heard by Egyptians, and we know that rumor of what was going on in that room came all the way to Pharaoh's ears. I can imagine Pharaoh's kind of concerned. So Joseph's having a meltdown. What's this over? What's going on with Joseph? Maybe I should send somebody to check on him? I don't know. Now look at verse 3. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph." This is the first time he tells them. And he has to tell them twice in this meeting. "I am Joseph." And then the first thing out of his mouth is, "My father still living?" Then it says, "But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence." Now that's realistic. That's real. The brothers were terrified. In fact, they could not even answer him. And I was wondering if you've ever had an experience where you were so shocked and so scared that your mind and your mouth would not connect. This was his brothers in this moment. And I was wondering, so what were the brothers afraid of? Well, our friend Bob Deffenbaugh at Bible.org wrestled with this a little bit, and I wanted to share with you some of his thoughts. And I'll share with part of it. I will not put this part on the screen, but a little bit later we'll put part of this up here. He says, Judah and his brothers were anxiously awaiting a verdict from Joseph. Remember, they were prostrate on the floor, except Judah had stood up and was speaking directly to him. They were expecting a verdict from Joseph, a verdict that would affect the course of their lives. And without knowing who Joseph is or what he intends to do, the brothers saw in this potentate, they saw him sending everyone out of the room. Perhaps they could already see tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. Perhaps they could see his chest beginning to heave with emotion. But their question was, what is the source of this great emotion in this very strange potentate? Was it anger? If it's anger, that's not going to look good for us. It's not going to turn out well. How could it be other than anger? They're thinking to themselves, because he has caught Benjamin red-handed with what they are supposing is thievery. And if they thought that the worst had already come, it had not, at least in their minds. For now, this Egyptian blurted out in their own tongue, "I am Joseph." Now that was the worst news they could ever have hoped to hear. It brought them no relief, only new avenues of anxiety. See, it was bad enough to stand before a powerful Egyptian governor who was angered at the theft of a cup, but to realize that he was their brother whom they had sold into slavery, that was too much. Before, they at least had a hope that this judge would be impartial and that mercy might motivate him to accept their appeal. But now their judge must surely be their enemy, whom they had unjustly condemned 22 years ago. How could they hope for better treatment from him? No wonder they were petrified. They were terrified. Oh no, just as we've suspected over these last months, divine justice is hunting us down. Now Joseph clarifies to his brother. He sees that they are dumbfounded, they can't even speak, that they're terrified. He calls them in close to him, and he issues them some words. And these words appear, I think it's between verses 3 and 4. I think that's where it is. And I want to break down what he says to them into 3 separate sections. 3 separate things I want you to notice in Joseph's declaration to his brothers. Here's the first one. I want you to notice Joseph's frank statement. He says, "I'm your brother, the one you sold into slavery." Okay. Now think about forgiveness and what are the implications of forgiveness. Guys, forgiveness does not mean that you deny the truth of what really happened. Do you see that? Nor does it mean skirting the issue. See, a lot of times we don't even know what it means to forgive. It doesn't mean that you have to pretend what happened didn't really happen. And it doesn't mean that you have to skirt the issue. Joseph did neither. He did not ignore it, and he did not minimize the sins of his brothers. He dealt with it head on. Does that kind of destroy your thinking about what forgiveness looks like? I am Joseph, the one you sold into slavery 22 years ago. Boy, he grabs the bull by the horns there. Now, the next thing I want you to notice about Joseph's declaration to his brothers is his generosity. Here's what he says. He says, "And now, don't be distressed and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here." Do you have that kind of generosity? Somebody ruins your life to that degree, and you say, "Don't be distressed over basically attempting to ruin my life." That is extraordinary. Extraordinary generosity. How gentle is this? How generous. He's telling them, he's saying, "You guys, don't beat yourselves up over what you did to me 22 years ago. Let it go." Now, the third thing I want you to observe about Joseph's declaration of himself to his brothers is this: Joseph's encouragement to his brothers to see a bigger picture, a much bigger picture than their own wrongdoing. Here's what he says to them. This is verses 5 through 8, the beginning of verse 8. He says, "And now don't be distressed and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that," who? "That God sent me ahead of you." Now, wait a minute. I thought it was the brothers who sold him. So what does God have to do with brothers seeking to ruin the life of a sibling? Whoa, now we're getting crazy. He goes on to say, "For 2 years now there have been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there'll be no plowing and reaping. But here's the God stuff again. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth. In other words, to keep your families from becoming extinct. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. A great deliverance? What's a great deliverance? One that nobody could have ever engineered or thought, how in the world is this going to work out like this? That's why it's great. Clearly divinely engineered, even using the wrongs, the sins, the heinous crimes of siblings against one another. That's a pretty great deliverance. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, he says, it wasn't you who sent me here, but God. So what is Joseph doing? He is pointing his brothers to the God who is greater even than their sin. And that reminded me of a song that the church has had for years, Grace Greater Than Our Sin. Grace greater than even our sin. Now, frankly, what we are encountering here, you guys, is, in my opinion, one of the greatest and most mysterious teachings in all of the Bible. It's mind-blowing stuff. It's this, that God has this extraordinary ability to take the bad and turn it into good. You know, you hear people issue that forth like a platitude. We talk about it all the time. Yeah, but do you feel the pain of Joseph? All of the bad, all of the hurt. That God, he believes, he's using it for something that is well beyond the evil intentions of people who are seeking to hurt him. See, nobody can do this like God can. And I thought, so what is the ultimate example? I'm wondering if somebody can tell me what is the ultimate example of God taking something that appears bad and using it for good. Christ where? On the cross, the crucifixion. I mean, how heinous is this? A God creates a race of people. Then he decides to come visit them with their skin on, and they receive him how? They spit at him. They beat him to a pulp. They humiliate him to the fullest extent of their ability to do so. They drive nails in his hands. They kill him in the most torturous manner they can contrive. That's pretty bad. And yet God does something through this that we all agree is extraordinarily good. He rescues us from that kind of heart and that kind of behavior through that most heinous of acts. And it wasn't a reactionary thing on the part of God. It was something that he chose beforehand to do in that way, as a way of absorbing in himself all of that evil. Because that's what forgiveness does. That's what it looks like. So, Defenbaugh says, the doctrine of the sovereignty of God assures us that while men may do the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, God can cause that evil to accomplish his good and perfect purposes. And that sounds all warm and fuzzy in church, but can you learn to live that? That is a challenge as people are in the process of seeking to do you harm. That's where it all comes out in the wash. And I'm wondering if anybody's ever seen an instant of that in your own life. Have you ever seen that to be true, where people have sought to do you wrong, and yet somehow you're able to see that something really, really good has come through that? Now's probably not the time to share it. This is something, though, that we Christ followers must accept and cling to by faith. Because if we can't hold on to this, we can't even agree with the gospel. Because that's what the gospel is. Something very terrible being dealt with by God and turned into something really good. So, look on the screen. Even the evil that people attempt to do to you is usable toward good in the hand of God. Now, apply this to yourself. Even the evil that you have perpetrated against others can be used for good in the lives of you and other people. Can you buy that one? Now, that should not encourage you to continue to perpetrate evil against other people. And it should not give you a free pass so that you think you don't need to go and address it with people who you've wronged. No, you still need to do that. But there is a God over all of this who can use even that evil for good. Now, so what happens as the story plays out? If you were to dive back into the passage, you would see immediately then, as Joseph starts talking in these terms of forgiveness for his brothers, he begins to evidence his forgiveness and goodwill towards his brothers by making arrangements for the entire family now to be moved down from Canaan, where there's no food, into Egypt, where he personally can see to their well-being. Amazing. That includes Dad. He has intentions then of caring for all of the family. Now, something that I thought was really cool, the passage tells us that when Pharaoh learns that Joseph's brothers have arrived in Egypt, he is thrilled. And what does this tell you about his respect for Joseph? It's amazing. Pharaoh is thrilled that Joseph's brothers have arrived. And you know what he even starts doing? He starts ordering for them to be brought down and settled in the best land, the best region of all of Egypt, the land of Goshen. And he personally starts giving orders that the Royal Egyptian Moving Company will go and help them move. He sends carts from Egypt so that they can comfortably as possible in 2000 BC, brought from Canaan down into Egypt. Pharaoh's giving orders about how this is to be done to make this easy, to expedite it. It's really beautiful. Now look at verses 14 and 15. We see a tear-filled hug fest breaking out. Then he, Joseph, threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. There's more crying. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. There's more crying. And he kissed all of his brothers and wept over them. More crying. And afterward, his brothers talked with him. Oh, they finally found their voices. Wouldn't you have loved to have been a fly on the wall? I would give about anything to be able to hear what transpired in that conversation. His brothers obviously begin to ask questions. If they're like me, they're thinking, how in the world did you get here, Joseph? How did this happen? How does it come to be that we're standing here in front of you and you're there and we're down here? How did this happen? And we remember those dreams that you had and you told us about. And would you imagine then that there's probably some, oh, Joseph, we are so sorry for what we did 22 years ago. It's haunted our lives for 22 years. Do you imagine that was part of the conversation? I guarantee you that was part of the conversation. So reconciliation has begun. Now look at 25 to 28. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, and they told him, Joseph's alive. In fact, he's ruler of all Egypt. Now, if you're Jacob, can you buy that? You know, this is going to be a tough thing to handle. It says Jacob was stunned. He didn't believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, I'm convinced. My son Joseph is still alive, and I will go see him before I die. Now, is this a drink of cool water for Joseph? That's how it feels to me. It says, the spirit of their father revived. It's like he wanted to get up and dance. He hasn't gotten out of bed in decades, and he wants to get up and dance. His spirit is revived. This, to Jacob, guys, was like a resurrection from the dead. For more than 2 decades, he has believed his son Joseph is dead. Which, guys, leads me to another point in which Joseph is like a type of Christ. He is received back from the dead. Think about it. Not literally from the dead, but for all intents and purposes, all his family thought he was dead. And now he's alive again? Well, Jesus was also received back from the dead. That's kind of a flimsy point to end on, but that's okay. I have some other ways that I think you see Joseph typifying Christ in here, but we'll save that for another time.